My name is Bill Haltom. Today is June the 13th, 2018, and I'm in Memphis, Tennessee today to interview Justice Janice Holder. This interview is taking place as part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation in conjunction with the Tennessee Supreme Court Historical Society. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Bill.
I know you as Justice Holder. I also know you as Janice. May I address you as Janice?
You certainly may.
Thank you, Janice. I appreciate this. Let's start at the very beginning. Tell us about where you grew up in Pennsylvania, and tell us about your mother and father.
Okay, I actually grew up outside of a small town named McDonald, Pennsylvania, and I was officially in Robinson Township. So I was outside of the borough of McDonald. And I grew up there, went to elementary school at McDonald Elementary, then went to Fort Cherry Junior Senior High School, and spent my entire childhood and teenage period in that area.
What part of the state is McDonald Township in?
It is the southwest portion of Pennsylvania, a little bit like Memphis is to Tennessee.
Okay. And in terms of proximity to major cities there that we would identify with?
It's very close to Pittsburgh.
Okay. All right. Now, I met your mother. I met Sylvia, and never met your father. But tell us a little bit about your remarkable parents.
Well, my parents were very interesting. My father started out as a musician, and he was a musician in a big band. So he played the drums, and my mother started out as the singer in a big band, and that's how she met my father. My mother actually got her first job as a result of Dean Martin's intervention.
Dean Martin's intervention. Tell us about that.
She was sort of trying out for the Lee Barrett Orchestra, and they were in Steubenville, Ohio, which is where Dino was from. And he came in to hear the band, and she sang, and he said to her, "Are you the new girl singer?" That's what they called them, girl singers. And she said, "Well, I'd like to be." So from that point on, whenever she sang, Dino and his entourage would just clap and, be wild about her singing, and she got the job.
And was your father in that band too?
Yes.
And your father, what instrument is your father?
He was drummer.
All right, he was the drummer. And was that where your father and mother met?
Yes.
Now, some of us are familiar with, even though it was a little bit before our time, we're familiar with big bands. What do you mean by a big band?
Well, it was a multi-piece band playing the big band sound is the only way I can really describe it. And if you look for big band music now, you can find it, and that's pretty much what I think of the big band era.
And this would have been in what decade? In the 40s,
40s.
The 50s, the 40s. Okay, all right. Was that job that your mother had singing and your father had drumming at that time, was that a full-time job, or did they?
No, it was part-time.
Part-time job. What did they do when they weren't singing or drumming?
Well, my mother really, that was pretty much what she did. She didn't do anything outside of that. My dad worked with his father, who had a furnace and roofing business. So that was the family business, was furnace and roofing. So on the side, he would work with my grandfather.
And did you know your grandparents well?
Yes.
Okay. And did y'all live in the same neighborhood or the same place?
Yes. Very close together.
Yeah. Now, I know that your mother continued to sing for the rest of her life, because I've heard her sing.
Right.
Yeah.
You probably heard her at Parkview.
I heard her at the Parkview, which is a retirement home here in Memphis, and she would sing with, I think, called the Doctor's Band.
Exactly.
Band there.
And I never heard her.
Oh.
I never heard her at any period in time. When she would be singing, she'd invite me, and I either couldn't get there when she was singing, or I got there after she had finished singing. Yeah. So I never did hear her.
Did your father continue his work as a musician?
He did not. He stopped and then went into the steel industry. In fact, during World War II, he worked in a shipyard welding LSTs, which were a type of transport boat. And he was not draftable, and he couldn't go into the Army because he was considered to be essential. So he stayed at Draveau Corporation working on LSTs throughout the war. After the war was over, he then enlisted in the Army.
You're the daughter of two musicians.
Yes.
Are you a musician?
I'm not. I mean, I did play the piano for quite a long time, but I did not continue it. When I went to college, I kind of let it go.
Okay. Do you have any siblings?
No. I'm
Only
an
child. Only child. Okay. So tell us a little bit more about your childhood in Pennsylvania and what you did, what your interests were.
Okay. I grew up on a street called Valley Street, and we walked back and forth to school. It was about a mile each way, and that's how I got to school. There was very little to do in the town itself. So there was roller skating, which I did, and there was ultimately tennis, which I took up when I was about 12 years old, and I played tennis pretty much every day in the summer, sometimes twice a day, and did that. Played a little bit during college, not much, and those were my interests. In school, I was a drum majorette, and I played timpani in the band during the off season, and played basketball, girls basketball, and there wasn't any girls tennis, so I couldn't play tennis.
I have to ask you this question because it's a personal interest I have. But girls in Pennsylvania, when you were a young lady, did y'all play full court or the six game?
6K.
3 forwards, 3 guards.
Yes.
Yeah. So were you a guard or were you a forward?
I was a forward.
Okay. So you were allowed to shoot the ball.
I was allowed to shoot the ball.
Yeah, that's
exactly.
That's interesting. So you were an athlete in terms of tennis and basketball, and a musician in terms of timpani. Yeah. I have to ask you this question. Any lawyers in your family when you were growing up?
None.
You're first generation lawyer.
Yes.
When did it first get on your radar screen that you might want to be a lawyer someday?
I planned to be an experimental psychologist. And I actually I was an author as a student. I was given credit for authoring an article in a journal of experimental psychology that had to do with oddity learning in the pigeon. Yes, oddity learning in the pigeon. It was an experiment to see if you could train a pigeon to pick the odd key. So if you had 2 blues and a yellow, to train the pigeon to pick the odd key. In any event, there was an article that I actually found recently and have downloaded from the internet where my name is on the article. And I was going to be a psychologist. So I applied to various schools throughout the country, and I started getting rejections, only to find out that Educational Testing Service failed to send my GREs to the schools to which I applied.
So they didn't even know what your GRE was?
No. So I got rejection letters, and I was forced to sit out for a year.
Let's back up,
yes.
if you don't mind. Okay. Because I'm enjoying this, but I want to get it all in the context of the time. You graduated from high school, and where did you go to college?
I started out at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. Very small liberal arts school. That's where I played tennis and basketball.
You played basketball and tennis in college as well?
Yes.
Okay.
And then I transferred to the University of Pittsburgh for my sophomore year. I graduated from the University of Pittsburgh in 1971. I had spent 1 year abroad at the University of Paris at Rouen in Normandy, and also at the Sorbonne.
Tell us what you studied there during that 1 year abroad.
French primarily.
Okay.
French primarily, and French literature, but French language. We had a linguistics professor who taught us the accent, which was really kind of unusual. I don't know that anybody does that at this point, but it really improved my French accent. So I was there for a semester, and then I was at the Sorbonne for the summer session.
Now, when you were an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, in addition to being an athlete, what else did you
University
do?
of Pittsburgh.
I'm sorry, I apologize, I misspoke. University of Pittsburgh. In addition to being an athlete, what else did you do, Janice? I know that pretty much is full-time jobs at the college level.
Well, it was, I was in a sorority, I think the same one that your wife was in.
KKG.
KKG, yeah. And so there were a lot of activities with the sorority, and I did the things that people normally did. I also was in a an organization called Orchesis, which is a dance group, and we did dance performances.
But at that time, as an undergraduate, you didn't have law school on your horizon at that point.
No,
Okay.
I was going to be a psychologist.
And so after you graduated, you applied, but since they didn't get your graduate scores, that closed that door, I guess. Hopefully it opened something else.
It did, and once I was rejected at all of those, I started wondering if that was really what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. So I sort of looked around and applied for other things. There was a very good paralegal school in Philadelphia, and I applied to the paralegal school. I interviewed for what was then Pan Am Airways, and so I was going to be a flight attendant there. I applied to get my teaching certificate in Pennsylvania so that I could teach French, and I applied to French graduate school, and I applied to one law school, Duquesne University School of Law.
Let's back up and talk about each one of those, if you don't mind. First of all, you said you considered going to paralegal school.
Yes.
And what was it about, I guess that was the first time you expressed some interest in law. What generated that?
It was the first time I thought about law was when this all happened. But when I was living in France, there were a couple of people who were talking about going to law school. And it sort of piqued my interest about going. I didn't know anything about it. But I thought, gee, if they can think about going to law school, maybe that's something I could do also.
Did you know any lawyers?
No.
No
My
lawyers?
grandfather, at one point, had been a justice of the peace.
Really?
In Pennsylvania.
Uh-huh.
He was, I guess, elected as the justice of the peace in that little community where I lived in the McDonald area.
But you didn't have to go to law school to be
No.
a justice of the peace in that era.
No.
And do you remember seeing him work as a justice of the peace when you?
No.
This was before you were born?
No, I would have been probably 12, 14, maybe younger.
Okay. Now, I'm intrigued about your interest at one time in possibly being a flight attendant. What was it about that interested you?
I liked to travel, and I had spent a good bit of time traveling up to that point because I'd spent time in France and had traveled all over Europe, and it was something that interested me very much.
And then the third area before you applied to law school was to possibly teach. You wanted to teach French?
Yes.
Do you still love French?
I do.
Do you travel much to France?
I
these
do. I
days?
spent a lot of time in France.
Really?
Yes.
Where do you go in France?
Well, I typically go to Normandy because that's the family with whom I lived when I was a student in 1970 lives there. And so there was a mother, father, and then the son and daughter at that point. And the son in that family just came to visit last summer with his family. So I've stayed in touch with them since 1970.
Really?
So they're kind of my family. They're my French family.
Yeah, yeah. What is it about France that first intrigued you when you were young?
Well, my grandmother was French.
Okay.
So she came from France. She came from France as a child. She was, I believe, 8 or 9 when she came.
Where in France was she from?
She came from a little town called Bessèges, which is north of Montpellier. Mm-hmm. And I went back there actually to visit. And there was a neighbor who lived on the same street that my grandmother did, who went back to France to live. So I visited the little village and visited the neighbor who had moved back from McDonald to Bessèges.
When you were growing up in France, did your grandmother speak French to you?
When I was growing up in McDonald?
Yeah, McDonald, Pennsylvania.
Yes. I would try to get her to speak French to me.
Yeah.
And she would. So I learned a little bit.
How old would you have been when you were learning French from your grandmother?
7, 8, 9.
Yeah. I've heard, have some experience as a parent on this, that that's the best way to learn language is to learn it when you're very, very young.
Yes. I think that's true.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you probably will say you're not fluent in French. Are you fluent in French?
No, I'm not fluent in French. You knew I wasn't going to say
because my own experience with linguists is they never say they're fluent in a language, even if they are.
Well, French was always difficult for me. It was my worst subject, which was kind of why I wanted to do it. It's the only course I ever got a C in.
Really?
I got a C+ in French. It was the only course I ever got a C in. And it was so painful that I decided if I'm going to go through that much pain, I might as well just go for it and learn it. And that's really why I went to France, was to sort of immerse myself in it and learn it.
And you go there to visit your French family
I do.
fairly often?
I do.
And are you...
I've spent a lot of time in almost all regions of France.
Really? Yeah. And what is it? I mean, you told us what it was that first interested you. It was your grandmother. What is it? And of course, you've gone to school there, visited there. What's the attraction now? What makes it another home to you in a way?
I find the culture very interesting. I find the geographic areas very different. I mean, in a fairly small area, there are all sorts of different geographic areas, from mountains to the sea, different historical areas,
Mm-hmm.
some of which were under British rule, and you had the Norman invasion of England. I mean, it's all historically very interesting, and I just find the people to be very interesting, and of course it helps to be able to speak the language.
Yeah. I meant to ask you this earlier, but what was it that brought your grandmother to America from France when you said she was 7, 8?
She was, yes. Her family, I wasn't quite sure, but they were miners. They worked in the mines, and they had some problems with the government in some fashion. And so they were either out of work or couldn't get work very easily. And so my understanding is they immigrated to the U.S. That was my grandmother on that side of the family. My grandfather on my father's side of the family, they were dairy farmers from Germany.
Hmm.
And although my grandfather was born in the U.S., his family emigrated from Germany.
Oh. Now I need to ask you about this. You graduated from college. You're looking at 3 or 4 different tracks, but you applied to Duquesne Law School. What motivated you to apply to law school?
It was just sort of casting a wide net, trying to figure out what to do next, and just waiting to see, what would materialize, whether I would be accepted in one or not the other, and what my choices were.
So you were just exploring in your early 20s all these different potential options.
Exactly.
Teaching, paralegal, flight attendant, or going to law school.
Right.
And obviously then you got the word you've been accepted to Duquesne. Where's Duquesne, incidentally?
Duquesne's in Pittsburgh.
And did you apply anywhere else?
No.
So and what was it about Duquesne that...
It was in Pittsburgh. It was easy.
Close by.
It was easy. I was in Pittsburgh. It was in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
There's one other law school there, which was the University of Pittsburgh, but I applied to Duquesne instead. I don't remember why I did, and not Pitt, but I just applied to Duquesne.
You started at Duquesne Law School in the fall of
72.
Okay. And did it click immediately, or did it take some time to click?
No, I wasn't certain I really wanted to be there. It took quite a while. And Pan Am kept calling, wanting to know if I was ready to start working for them yet. And so I just kept plugging away. And I really, the first semester, I got my grades back. And the subjects I thought I really knew well, I got C's in. And the subjects I thought I didn't know very well, I got A's and B's in. And I thought it was really kind of crazy. So I decided I was never going to look at my grades again. So I got with one of my law school buddies, and I drafted a power of attorney to give to him so he could check my grades. Okay. And I then did not look at my grades the next semester. And he was authorized to go and look at my grades to make sure that there wasn't something like an incomplete or something that would have to be addressed, that was a normal. So that's how I started out, because I really didn't think it made any sense what they were doing grade-wise. So then all of the professors found out that I wasn't looking at my grades. And everybody got very upset about it, and it caused so much consternation that I decided I would keep doing it, because it really apparently got to them. So
Do you have any idea why it bothered them? Did they indicate why it bothered them?
No, I just sort of figured that they kind of lost a little bit of control, and that, that was of concern. So from that point on to the end of my law school career, never looked at my grades. And I had the same person from my law school class check my grades every semester.
Have you ever looked at your transcript?
I did,
Okay.
after I graduated, because I was applying to places and had to provide a transcript. So I decided it was safe at that point to look at it.
Now, you said that initially in law school you weren't sure that this was the right way to go. Did there come a time in law school where you said, yeah, I think this is really the career I want to pursue?
No.
Really? Never did?
I kept getting to the point where I thought, I will go ahead and I will finish law school, take the bar exam, give it a year or two, and see how I like it.
So you weren't even sure in law school
No.
whether you were going to pursue a career as a lawyer?
No.
Much less to be on the state Supreme Court someday?
No.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I want to get back to your position that you wouldn't look at your grades, and you learned that the faculty, the members of the faculty that were not happy with you for not looking at your grades. Do you regard yourself as a maverick back then?
No, I really didn't.
Yeah.
I really didn't. It was just something just felt like the right thing to do, because I didn't want to get caught up in the grade thing. My feeling was if I studied something and learned it, that should be enough. I shouldn't have to worry about what the grade was that I got on the test. So my goal was to simply take that out of the equation and study what I was supposed to be studying and learn it to the best of my ability.
Even though you weren't sure during all this that you wanted to go into a legal career, were there any particular courses you took in law school that you really interested you?
I went to a law school that didn't give you any choices in what you took.
Okay.
Everything was required. There were very few electives, and those were mostly limited to the third year. So everything was required. Everybody took the same courses. There were a few electives like a family law course or some other courses, but everything was required.
Of the required courses, was there anything that really intrigued you, or was it just, I got to get through all this and not see the grades and pass everything?
I enjoyed tort law, contract law particularly, and I had a great time with estates and trusts.
Really?
Yeah, I loved it.
What was it about estates and trusts? That's very different from torts and
No.
contract.
The professor was great, and it was just a wonderful course, and I still remember what I learned. And it's just amazing, not even having a practice at any real point that involved estates and trusts, I still pretty much remember it. And it was because of the instructor, I think, professor.
Was this professor a mentor to you, or just a good professor?
He was a good professor.
Yeah.
He ended up being the assistant dean, and really had I think a really positive effect on a lot of students.
Were there any other professors in law school that you regarded as people that inspired you to go into this career eventually?
I don't know. I had a contracts professor who was really very inspiring, I thought, and he actually was the person who took over the Admiralty volume, the Moore's Admiralty. And so I learned Admiralty of all things in the
Really?
law. But there was an Admiralty practice in Pittsburgh because of the river.
Were you involved in any activities in the law school?
Well, I was on law review.
I was going to ask about that.
So I sort of figured I was doing okay.
Yeah, you didn't have to look at your grades to learn that you're doing okay.
If you were invited for law review, then you knew that you were doing okay.
What did you do in the law review?
I was the executive reasoned decisions editor.
Really? Okay. And did you write a note?
I didn't write a note. I wrote a recent decision.
Okay.
And they didn't require you to write a note at that point. I think now it probably is a requirement. But I didn't get to that point, and I was so busy editing notes, or recent decision type notes, that I really never got around to writing the note that I should have written.
Do you remember what the topic was of the recent case you were going to write about?
It was a case involving sexual discrimination, and I think the name of it was Richardson, and that was the case I wrote about.
Did you go to law school year round, or did you take the summers off?
Took the summers off.
What did you do during your summers when you were a law student?
I was a server.
I beg your pardon?
I was a server in what was a Stouffer's restaurant.
Really?
In Pittsburgh. It wasn't called Stouffer's, but it was a spin-off of the Stouffer's chain. And that's how I spent my time. I also, 1 year, was an intern for a federal magistrate. And I worked on pro se petitions. Did
the Duquesne Law School have a clinic?
No.
No clinic at that time. Yeah, okay. All right. So you graduated. Obviously, you never saw your grades, but I think you got a federal clerkship after you graduated. Is
I did.
That right?
As I said, must have been doing okay.
Doing okay for that.
Yeah.
Who did you clerk for?
I clerked for a gentleman by the name of Herbert P. Sorg. He was the chief judge of the district, and he was probably the finest trial judge I've ever seen.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. Was that a 1 year clerkship? Or
it was a 2 year clerkship.
2 year clerkship. Okay. And now I have to ask you this. You know this question is coming. Okay, so you graduate from law school. You're still not sure you're going to pursue a career. Now you're clerking for was he a federal judge?
Yes.
Federal judge. Yeah, you're clerking for a federal judge. At that point, did you have any vision that you might be
at that point, I decided I wanted his job.
Okay, that's exactly what I was asking.
Yes. No, it was the most fantastic experience I've had in my life, really.
And what was it about a judgeship, as you saw through Judge Sorg, that made it intriguing to you?
He was one of those people who really had law clerks he didn't need. He had 2 law clerks. He didn't need either of them. He was perfectly capable of handling the whole thing by himself, but he took law clerks to teach them. And so what he required was that both law clerks be in the courtroom at all times. One law clerk served as the bailiff, because you could have a law clerk then instead of a bailiff. Or you could have a bailiff and one law clerk. And so he would have the bailiff/law clerk sitting at the bench, like one tier below his bench. And then there would be the second law clerk who could come in and out as needed, but had to be in the courtroom. So if you were researching, writing, whatever you were doing, you did it in the courtroom, and you had to listen to all the trials. If you were the one who was the bailiff/law clerk, you took notes for the judge, which he didn't need because he didn't need them. But he would quiz you later on what you heard or what you saw or what you thought. And the other law clerk would simply be there to absorb whatever was going on. So I got to listen to 2 years' worth of trials. I got to hear, the first trial I ever heard was a products liability case that went for 2 weeks, in which there were no objections made because there were no objectionable things said.
That's interesting.
And I've never seen it since, but Judge Sorg pointed out to us after the trial that there had been, and there had not been, the first objection, because it was the cleanest trial he had ever seen. And so that was my experience the first trial, and then I got to watch both criminal trials, civil trials, in 2 solid years. When he took senior status, we went to Arizona and to Maine, but in Arizona, we watched F. Lee Bailey defend a case, criminal case. Yeah. And
I bet there were objections in that trial.
Well, I saw, again, a first, that the case was dismissed at the close of the prosecution's proof. I've never seen anything quite like that before, but the prosecution hadn't proven its case, and it got dismissed.
Were you impressed by F. Lee Bailey?
Yes, very much so.
Were there any other lawyers during the 2 years you were with Judge Sorg that you said, wow, I'd like to emulate that maybe in the courtroom sometime?
I was impressed with most of the people that I saw in federal court. I had to learn, though, the one thing I had to be very careful of was when I was being the clerk/bailiff and I'd be sitting taking my notes, found myself looking up when I expected someone to make an objection. And I had to learn not to do that because the lawyers were picking up on the fact that I would look up and they would object. So I'd keep my head down and just take notes so that I wouldn't cue anybody that something could be objectionable.
Right. So it was during that time that you began to obviously decide this is definitely you wanted to be a lawyer, and that you might even want to be, if the dream came true, to be a judge like your mentor.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. After the clerkship, after the 2-year clerkship, you started your law career. I guess you started your law career as a clerk, actually, but
Yes.
Tell us what you did at the end of the 2-year clerkship.
I accepted a position with a 2-person law firm in Pittsburgh, and I became their associate. Their associate had left. I took the place of the associate that left. And my first trial was a jury trial in federal court.
Really?
Mm-hmm. By myself.
And how long had you been out of your clerkship by this time?
Maybe 8 months, maybe.
So, pretty soon.
Yes.
What's the name of the firm in Pittsburgh that you were with?
Catalano and Catalano.
Okay. And you had your first jury trial. You were lead counsel or the sole counsel?
I was sole counsel.
Yeah. What kind of case was it?
It was a Labor Management Relations Act, Section 301 case. And I knew nothing about labor law. So I had to learn.
And you represented?
I represented the plaintiff. The firm represented the plaintiff. I inherited the case.
Back to your clerkship before the Catalano. Was the fact that you had been a federal law clerk, was that did that make you in demand for a law job in the private sector?
Yes and no. At that point, hiring women wasn't really high on everyone's list. There were some women who had already been hired. So the first wave of women had been hired in law firms, and to some extent, I think the thinking was we've done what we need to do, and that's good enough for right now. Mm. So there wasn't I wouldn't say there was a huge demand for women. In fact, when I applied for the clerkship, there were only 2 judges out of the 8 or 9 who would hire women.
Really? What percentage of your law school class was female?
We had the highest percentage ever, and out of, I've forgotten the total number in the class, but there were 13 women, and not all of the 13 graduated.
So back to your first jury trial. You said it was a labor law matter?
It was a labor law matter.
And you represented?
The plaintiff.
The plaintiff, okay. And what basically was the issue in the case?
It was a fair representation / breach of contract case, which is what a 301 action was. And I didn't have a case. The problem was I didn't have a case. And I could have told them how to get rid of me, but they didn't do it. I mean, so we went to trial, and I knew I wasn't going to survive, really, a directed verdict, but had to get through it. And the defense attorneys, there were 2 of them, one representing management, one representing union, did enough during my portion of the trial that the court had to let it go all the way through.
Really?
So we went all the way to the close of their proof, and then he granted a directed verdict.
So if they hadn't asked any questions, you hadn't made out a case?
If they hadn't done some of what they thought was very innovative behavior, it would have been ended at the close of the plaintiff's proof, but it ended up being directed at the close of the defendant's proof.
Did you realize as a young lawyer at that time that they were making a mistake?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I never figured out whether they didn't know what to do or whether they were just deliberately dragging it out. I couldn't figure out the motivation, but I knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what they should have been doing, and they just didn't do it. But it gave me the opportunity to try a jury case.
Sure, yeah. Did you try more jury cases after that?
At that point, I was about at the time that I moved to Memphis.
Okay.
So the weather in Pittsburgh was so brutal back then. It was 75, 77. I was getting frostbite on a regular basis.
Really?
It was really bad. So I really wanted to move farther south, and the opportunity arose to get south, and I came to Memphis.
Now, how did the opportunity arose for you to come to Memphis?
I was married to a lawyer, and he got a job offer in Memphis.
Okay.
So I came along kind of for the ride.
Did you have any knowledge of Memphis or the state of Tennessee prior to your marriage and your move here?
Not really. I think we made 1 or 2 visits to interview here, and I do remember that my husband's, one of required reading for my husband was a book, and I think it was by Taylor, called The Mind of the South. And beyond that, that's pretty much all I knew about Memphis.
Did he have any Memphis connections, or was it just the job?
No,
just the job
just job.
offer. Yeah. Okay. So when you moved to Memphis, what year would that have been?
It was mid 1979.
Okay. And where did you go to work in Memphis?
Well, that was very interesting. I really couldn't get a job in Memphis. I sent a lot of resumes out and really couldn't get an interview.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and why do you believe that was the case?
It was my feeling at the time that women just weren't being hired. Mm-hmm. And I think there was also a problem with having a spouse that was a lawyer. Mm-hmm. The potential of having 2 lawyers, one each in different law firms, was at that point novel and cause for concern somehow. I never quite understood it, but it was cause for concern.
And their reaction of the male dominated bar at that time was that would be resolved by the husband getting a job and the wife not.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And when did you find employment here, and where?
Well, I found employment at Holt Batchelor, was then Holt Batchelor, Spicer and Ryan. And I started there in January of 1980.
And who hired you at Holt Batchelor?
Ralph Holt.
Ralph Holt did. Okay.
Ralph Holt.
All right. And what was the nature of the work you were hired to do at Holt Batchelor in early 1980?
I was hired to do aviation law.
Really?
When I was clerking, we had some aviation issues in federal court, and I knew something about aviation law, and so they hired me to work on a plaintiff's case involving a trainer, a FedEx trainer, and a Cessna 150 that was involved in a midair collision in Memphis, and it's fairly famous. It's called the Memphis Midair. The Memphis Midair collision, and that had occurred sometime prior to my arriving in Memphis. So I was hired to work on that case, and when that case settled, I was hired to work on, I was still working there, and I started working on a products liability case involving another airplane.
Really? So the young woman who once thought about being a Pan Am flight attendant is now working on aviation cases. Yes. That's really interesting. How long did you work in the aviation litigation area?
It wasn't too long, and then they switched me over to the defense side. So maybe a year and a half, a year and a little more, and then I started doing some defense work.
And this was at the Holt Batchelor firm. Okay. When did you start? Did you start making court appearances in Memphis about that time?
Yes, but it was odd because, again, I want to say it was thought that clients would not like to be represented by women. And so you, as a woman, really didn't need to be making court appearances. Unless you were sitting second chair or something like that.
Yeah. Were you ever lead counsel in any of these aviation matters?
No.
You working with Ralph Holt and others? Yeah.
Yes.
How big was the Holt Batchelor firm in those days?
Well, it was considered to be a medium-sized firm. Mm-hmm. So there were the named partners, and then there were a few associates. So I don't remember exactly.
Olin Batchelor and Joe Spicer.
Joe Spicer, Ralph Holt, Tim Ryan.
Tim Ryan, yeah.
Somewhere along in there, Gene Gehrig was in there. Bob Flynn came on. Mm-hmm. Rick Rudstrom was in there. I don't remember whether he was a partner before I left or after I left, but that was basically the makeup of the firm with a few associates.
Now, you don't have to answer this question, but do you remember your salary in 1980?
Oh, it was It was very low. I can't remember if it was. I'm sure it wasn't over 20,000. It was under.
Did you get a salary, or did you have some kind of bonus system?
No, there was no bonus system.
Okay,
it
you
was
just
straight.
got a salary. Got a salary. And do you remember some of the judges you appeared in front of as a young lawyer in Memphis in that era?
Well, they let me go to General Sessions Court. So I remember Morgan Fowler, and I remember probably most of the General Sessions judges because I was allowed to make some appearances.
General Sessions Court was the court. Well, they don't like to hear small claims, but the claims at that time were referencing claims of under 5,000 at one time, was it not?
Back then, it might have been 15. I don't remember what it was. It wasn't 25. It was increased later.
Did you make many appearances down there? Is that kind of where you cut your teeth as a?
I'll say yes, but I really didn't make that many appearances at all because there was still this feeling that clients really wouldn't like a woman representing them in court.
Did that?
Now, I was allowed to go. I was allowed to do appeals.
Really?
I did a couple of appeals to the Court of Appeals. I actually did one to the Supreme Court.
Really? What year would have been your first appeal to the Tennessee Supreme Court?
Well, I only worked for them for two and a half years. So it would have been before the end of probably 1982.
Did you write the brief?
Yes.
Did you argue the case?
Yes.
Who was on the bench when you remember who was on the bench when you argued?
I think Justice Phones was the Chief Justice. So Harbison, Phones. Gee, I don't remember exactly what that court would have been completely.
Okay.
Probably Cooper.
Okay. No female members at that
No.
time. All right.
No.
Did you feel like you were being held back in your career at that time because you were female, or was that just the way it was and you just didn't even question it?
It's a hard thing to really answer. I really felt the difference between Pittsburgh and Memphis. And it was that women were accepted to some extent. I mean, not completely, but to some extent in Pittsburgh, to the point that my trying a case by myself in federal court was a little novel. I mean, it was commented on, but it wasn't a huge thing.
Right.
Here, it was almost like stepping back a couple of decades.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it was the culture. I mean, it was what I had to deal with, so I dealt with it.
Was that discouraging, or did it just make you more determined, or how did you react to that?
I think at first it upset me, but then I just decided this was where I was. It was a different culture. I needed to learn to live in a different culture, and that made the difference.
Yeah. Now you made a move from the whole bachelor firm after a couple of years. Where did you go next in your career?
I went out on my own.
Really?
And practiced on my own for a while.
I got your shingle as old timers.
Yes, I went back and forth. I'd be in a firm and then I'd go out on my own, and I liked both, and so I could never really figure out whether I really liked the freedom of being on my own versus being in a law firm. So I was actually also in the James S. Cox and Associates firm just before I left and ran for office.
Okay.
So I went in and out.
Now, Jim was a very established plaintiff's lawyer in the city, and when you were doing your own practice or working with Jim some, what kind of cases were you working on?
When I was with Jim, I was still working pretty much on the same kinds of cases that I worked on, largely domestic relations, but other things that came along that were of interest. And I also helped as needed when he needed help or wanted help on a med-mal case or something similar.
Now, you had moved to Memphis right at the end of the 70s, 79.
Yes.
And you're practicing law here, either with the Holt firm or Jim Cox or on your own in the 80s. Did you get involved in the life of the city in addition to being a lawyer?
Yes. I got involved, first of all, in the Bar Association. And I really credit Mary Margaret Weddington, if you remember Mary Margaret.
Mary Margaret well.
For getting me involved in the Memphis Bar Association. She kind of dragged me along and introduced me and got me involved in what the young lawyers were doing. And that's really was my introduction to the bar, was through the Memphis Bar Association. It was very beneficial, and it really made me feel much more plugged into what was going on. I also eventually got on a board here and there to get more involved in the community, and did that on somewhat of a limited basis, but my basic activities were really through the Bar Association.
What was some of the things you did with the Bar Association?
Trying to remember now. One of the things that I did, which is not well remembered, is that we had something called the Memphis Bar Journal.
I remember it.
And I ended up editing it. And somewhere along the way, it morphed into the magazine.
Right.
But for a while, I still have the editions of the Memphis Bar Journal that we did.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you enjoy that? Did
Very
you enjoy
much
the
so.
journalism? Yeah. Now, we're going to get to pretty shortly you running for a judgeship in Memphis in 1990. Is that when you
1990.
first? 1990. Okay. This is a pretty meteoric rise from 1979 to 1980 for a young woman from Pennsylvania to come to Memphis, and then within 10 years approximately running for and being elected judge. What do you attribute? What were you doing during that time period, or is it a comment on Memphis being an open kind of town?
As I mentioned earlier, when I clerked for the federal judge, for Judge Sorg, was when I realized what I really wanted to do was be a judge. And I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a judge. And so I had to figure out how to get there. And truthfully, had I stayed in Pennsylvania, I think it would have been a pretty direct path, because I had enough friends who had enough friends that either I would have gotten an appointment, or I had enough that I would be able to run for an office and make a pretty good showing. But when I came to Memphis and encountered what I saw here, I realized that it was probably not going to happen. So
why did you feel that time was probably not going to happen?
Because I was having a hard enough time getting a job, much less figuring out how to be a judge. So I just didn't really worry about it anymore. I just put my nose to the grindstone and worked and did my things in the Bar Association and worked hard and did the best I could for my clients and just kept on going.
Did Memphis have any female judges in the 80s?
Early, Julia Gibbons
right.
was on the bench for a short period of time before she was elevated to the federal bench. And then after that, I think that was probably 83, somewhere in there. And then after that, not until 1990.
Right, until your election. Yes,
Right.
we'll get to that in just a moment. Did you meet Judge Gibbons during that time period?
Yes.
Did y'all become friends?
Yes.
Did the fact that Judge Gibbons, I think she went on the bench in the early 80s, did the fact that the state circuit trial judgeship, the fact that she did that give you some inspiration? Maybe you could pull this off?
Well, she was appointed.
Mm-hmm.
She was appointed by the governor, and she had worked in that administration. So it didn't give me any hope, because I didn't know anybody, and no governor was going to appoint me. So that route, to me, was sort of foreclosed. So I just kept working, and until 1989, 1990, when it was an election cycle, and started focusing a little bit on what was going on in the election cycle.
Let's back up just for a few minutes. I'm anxious to get to your election in 1990, but again, I want to talk a little more about what you did in the 80s. Did you have a lot of jury trials when you were on your own, or with Jim Cox?
There were a couple. I can only really remember one while I was working with Jim Cox that really was a jury trial from beginning to end. Before that, some jury trials at Holt Bachelor, Spicer and Ryan, where I did take a role, or I questioned a witness, but really had no major role other than working on the case and getting it ready for trial.
When you were practicing as Janice Holder in a solo practice, what kind of cases did you handle at that time?
It ended up being primarily domestic relations.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, those weren't jury trials.
Yeah.
But primarily domestic relations, a few other things, a little bit of estates and trusts, not much. Primarily domestic relations.
And to what extent did those kind of cases, you believe, help prepare you eventually for a judgeship?
Well,
if you feel they did.
When, of course, at least at that time, and probably still today, a large part of what circuit and chancery courts does involve domestic relations, and having a good knowledge of that law and being temperamentally suited to hear those cases, I think was a plus.
Let's get to the 1990 election.
Okay.
And you indicated that as early as '89, you began to look at the possibility of running for the judgeship in 1990, correct?
Right.
And what judgeship were you interested in? What was there available for you to run for?
The one that everyone sort of had an eye on was Division II of Circuit Court, because nobody was quite certain whether Chuck McPherson would run again or not. And it wasn't until fairly late in the process that he announced that he wasn't going to run, as I recall. And so it became an open seat.
This is Judge Charles McPherson.
Yes.
At that time, were judicial races on a party ticket, or how was that handled at that time?
They were nonpartisan in really the truest sense of the word. I didn't know if there were party affiliations. I didn't know what they were. I mean, you could kind of assume or think that one person was affiliated with one party or another, but the parties really didn't take an active role in endorsing judges. It was people didn't. It wasn't done that way. You could have very liberal Democratic support and also very conservative Republican support, and no one cared that both ends of the spectrum were supporting you. Very different, I think, than it is probably today. The concern was, would you be a good judge?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Could you administer justice fairly?
And you said you became interested in the 1990 election as early as 1989, obviously.
Well, late 1989.
Late 89, okay. And I'm just curious as to how you proceeded with this effort. Did you get folks together to talk about a campaign? What did you do?
Well, first of all, I asked people's opinion as to what they thought, because I went through a process. I sort of decided it was something I could do. I kind of got through my head that this was going to be, by the time I decided to do it, it was really January. Okay. So I figured for 8 months I could pretty much do it. I could campaign for 8 months and it wasn't going to really do a whole lot of damage. Mm-hmm. So I started asking people what they thought about my running for office.
Are these people fellow lawyers?
Some fellow lawyers, some judges.
Mm-hmm.
Judges and lawyers. And I would say uniformly, either there was a show of concern that I would even be thinking about it, or really advising me not to do it and to take that period of time and work in another judge's campaign to see how it operated, how things worked, what you needed to do, to get some experience in how a campaign worked in Shelby County.
And so most of the reaction you got was people were attempting to discourage you from running in 1990. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you, what was your reaction to that?
Well, I understood what they were saying, and I think they were right. Their advice was very good. I had no political experience. I'd never worked in somebody's campaign. I didn't know how they worked. I didn't know what to do. And then I just decided to do it anyway. It wasn't that I thumbed my nose at the advice. I didn't. I understood what they were saying, and I think they were very correct. But I was concerned that if I didn't do it, I would wake up, 5 years later and wonder what would have happened if I had tried.
Did you actually, when you decided to pursue it, did you actually believe that you were going to win?
I don't know if I believed I could win. I believed that if you were qualified and if you could be a good candidate and a good judge, that you could win. I don't know that I really translated it to I could win. I just thought that the important thing was that you were qualified. And I thought I was qualified. So I thought I would do it. And I don't think I thought quite that way. So that's when I just decided to get a petition put together and file it.
Do you regard yourself as a fearless person?
I don't know. I didn't see it as being a risk. I just saw it as being an experience.
Right. But the worst thing that can happen is you don't win the election.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
And you have the experience of finding out firsthand how an election is run.
Now, you said you had a lot of the people you talked to discouraged you and told you to wait. Were there any people that said, no, Janice, you ought to do this now?
I think there were. I think there were people who really said, this is something that you probably ought to think about doing. Mm-hmm. A few. And once I decided to commit, then there were people who committed to helping me. Yeah. So it was that first step. Once I took the first step, then it all started coming together and started making some sense.
Did you talk to Judge McPherson about it?
No, I didn't.
Y'all became close over the years.
And
I know you became close.
He eventually, said something to me later. I felt awkward because by the time I got in the race, there were already several people who had announced their candidacy and had already lined up a whole lot of support throughout the community and had endorsements. So by the time I got in, I was sort of a latecomer to the process.
Okay. Memphis is obviously a big town, about 1.3 million now. I guess then it was smaller, but still a huge town, known as a very diverse place. How did you go about campaigning for this job in this city?
I got very good advice. I had as campaign people who helped me in my campaign, Bill Gibbons and Hardy Mays. And
you had two very good politicians
great
there.
Politicians helping me out. I got advice along the way from people whose opinion I trusted, and I, did a lot of things that they advised me to do. If there was something they advised me to do, I did it. If there was a gathering, I went there. I mean, sometimes I saw the same people at the same gathering over and over and over again, but the point was to get your name out, and collect a vote, collect one vote at a time.
How had you met both Bill and Hardy?
That's a good question. I think I met Bill because of Julia.
Julia Gibbons. Uh-huh.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as a couple, I probably met them, and then Hardy I met through the Bar Association, definitely, because I think we were running for a position on the board at the same time.
I see.
Board Bar Association.
Now, both Bill and Hardy, of course, were very involved in Memphis politics at the time.
Yes.
Bill, I think, actually ran for mayor, in the 80s, and was on the city council, eventually the governor's cabinet.
Yes.
And Hardy, of course, was, before becoming a federal judge, was the top aide to Governor Sundquist, I think. Was he deputy governor or something? That was
before. It was right.
Yeah, right.
Right. It was when I applied for the Supreme Court, Hardy was there.
There you go. Okay,
yes. That's
what I was trying to, okay. And so they kind of mentored you in a way as to who to go see. And
exactly.
Et cetera. Okay. At that time, did your status as female, do you think that hurt your candidacy or helped in some areas of your candidacy, or both or neither?
I don't think it hurt. I encountered, when I was campaigning, people who were pleasantly surprised that women, because there was more than one woman, but women were campaigning. And I even remember one person saying to me, well, it's time that we tried a woman or two because the men haven't done such a great job. I mean, people would say things like that. or they were pleasant and not the least bit derogatory about a woman running for a judgeship.
How many other candidates were in the race?
There were 6 total, I believe. So in the beginning 5, I think, in addition to me, and then one person dropped out of that race and ran against somebody else.
Was there a bar primary in those days? The Memphis bar, did they have a primary?
They did. I don't know whether it's not the same kind of old style primary that was under former, city administrations, but there was a judicial poll, I believe.
I think that was a misnomer called the bar primary.
Right.
People
Judicial
sometimes call it, but essentially a poll there. How'd you fare in that?
I think I did very well. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think I got high marks.
And so then in August of 1980, the election's held.
Yes.
And who won the election?
I did.
There you go.
Yes, I remember that well.
Was it close?
I think there was a spread of about 4,000 votes to the next person, if I remember correctly.
So now this dream that you first had when you were clerking for Judge Sorg in Pennsylvania, now you're putting on the black robes. Okay. You would have been sworn in, in September of 1980?
Yes.
And that was the state circuit court.
1990.
I apologize, 1990, I misspoke. In 1990, and that would have been the state trial court here.
Right.
And you were elected to
Division 2 of Circuit Court.
Division 2 of Circuit Court, and that would have been for an 8-year term at that time?
Yes.
8-year term. Okay. So, did you immediately think when you first few weeks on the bench that this is exactly what you had dreamed of doing? Or
Exactly.
There you go. Never.
It was what I was born to do.
Really?
I felt like I've just died and gone to heaven. I mean, it was that much of a relief.
And what was it about it that really you just said, "Oh, this is so good"?
It just felt natural.
Yeah.
It just felt very, very natural. When I was a lawyer, it never felt that way. I always felt that I had to really work hard at taking that position and figuring out how to be an advocate for a particular position. And the way I approached it, almost always, was to really look at the way the case should come out, how it should be determined, and then work backwards from it to try to figure out how to advocate my client's position. It was never natural for me to advocate. It was natural for me to find a resolution and to figure out how the case should be resolved. And so I had to kind of work my way backward from that. So now I didn't have to do the advocacy part of it, and I could simply, if I were sitting in a bench trial, rule as I felt the law and the facts required.
You had practiced law for about 10 years prior to this.
In Tennessee for 10
Tennessee,
years.
excuse me, I apologize.
In Pennsylvania, another 4, so about 14 years.
Did you know most of the lawyers that came before Judge Janice Holder?
I did. I knew a lot of the lawyers. That was one of the things that was mentioned to me when I was thinking about running, is that your only base is the Bar Association. You know the lawyers, but you don't know anybody else in Memphis. And I did know the lawyers well because I had done a fair amount in the Bar Association. I had run for the board of the Bar Association and had been elected as a board member. So people knew who I was and people interacted with me. So I knew the bar. It was everybody else that I didn't know.
Well, we're about to start asking questions about your era as a trial judge and then on to the appellate bench, but this would be a good time to take a break.
Very good.
All right, so you went on the bench in September of 1990, and I was asking you about the lawyers who appeared in front of you, and you said you knew many, if not most of them, from your previous work as a lawyer. Is that correct?
Correct.
Private bar. Did your relationship with them change because you're now the judge?
Yes and no. I didn't feel that it was a huge change. I still felt as if I were plugged into the legal community and connected to people, although it's natural that people are going to treat you a little bit differently if you're a judge.
Now, I've heard some people say when they go on the bench that it can be kind of a lonely experience, that you don't feel quite as close to people as you did before. Did you? And then I've heard others say that they just absolutely feel like their world is full of people and they enjoy it. Which of those extremes did you fall on, or was it somewhere in the middle?
I guess I would say it's somewhere in the middle. I didn't feel isolated at all because you could still do pretty much everything that you would normally do. You just had to be careful about creating conflicts or recognizing conflicts if you were doing something and someone came in front of you and you realized that you had a connection with that person recently that you really had to disclose. But it wasn't, to me, very isolating because you were still seeing the same people and you were still going to the same events.
When you were a new judge, were there any judges that you became close to on the bench that became mentors to you at that time?
Yes. Of course, I practiced law. I don't want to say practice law. I was in the same office space with Butch Childers for about 2 years when I was out on my own, one of those periods of time. And I was in office space with Butch Childers and Donna Fields and Lonnie Evans and essentially those three.
Who all became judges.
Who all became judges, except Lonnie, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was close to Butch, as originally anyway. And then I became close to Wyeth.
Wyeth Chandler.
Yes.
Now, I know about your friendship with Wyeth, which I'm very intrigued by. Wyeth Chandler, of course, was mayor of Memphis before he went on the bench, and then was on the bench, ultimately became went into mediation. And may I just say this, you and Wyeth were as different in terms of perspective and political, I shouldn't say politically, whatever, as you could be. Would that be a fair comment?
Sort of.
But you were very close.
Sort of. When I first was elected, I remember my friend Terry Keeter saying to me, "You are going to love Wyeth Chandler."
Terry Keeter was?
The political reporter for the Commercial Appeal.
For the Memphis morning newspaper, the Commercial Appeal, huh?
And I said, I am not going to like Wyeth Chandler. And I came to love Wyeth Chandler because he really, to me in a large way, was a lot of bluster with a great big heart. Mm-hmm. Very, very bright, very intelligent, knew the law, was just a very interesting and engaging person. And I pretty much ate lunch every day with Butch and Wyeth.
Really? Now, Wyeth, of course, was old enough to be your father. He was much senior, yeah. And then Butch was a
contemporary.
Contemporary, yeah. That's interesting. What did you learn from each of them? What sort of support did you receive?
Well, Butch, of course, had been on the bench since 1984, so he had the experience and had procedural experience that I could draw on. And Wyeth was just an amazing intellect. When I first got on the bench, we had the transfer system where judges sort of transferred cases among whomever they wanted to transfer. Not necessarily everyone, but some. And I would be very, regimented. I had 4 cases. One case I'd get started on. There were 4 sitting there waiting to either go to trial, to get picked up by somebody else, or just continued if you couldn't get them tried. And I'd be sitting there getting my case started, and Wyeth would send his deputy around and take the first case. And then about 45 minutes later, Wyeth would come around, take the second case. Another half hour would go by, Wyeth would take the third case. And by the time that he was finished, he had taken all 4 of my cases that were waiting and disposed of them. And he disposed of them from the bench. I never really knew what he did. I mean, probably very much what he did as a mediator. He just mediated them from the bench or talked to them or told them to settle it or whatever he did, he was effective. And he just disposed of the cases.
He had incredible people skills,
yes.
didn't he? He could
amazing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Like I said, I know he was very fond of you. I know he used to write you poems from time to time.
He wrote me a poem when I left the circuit court bench, which I have on my wall, about leaving the bench and going on to another court. So
I remember it well. I was at the party where it was
Yes.
read. It was read. Were most of your trials during the years you were on the circuit bench, was that mostly bench trials, or were there jury trials, or both?
there were a lot of jury trials. It was a mixture of bench and jury, but a lot of jury trials.
Which did you enjoy the most, being the judge in a bench trial, or being the judge in a jury trial?
I loved jury trials.
What was it about jury trials that intrigued you?
I'm a big fan of juries, and it's from my days of being a clerk and watching the juries in action when I was a clerk. And I'm a great believer in the jury system. I think they generally get it right.
What is it about jurors that your own experience is that makes you believe they generally get it right?
I think they take their jobs very seriously. I think they listen carefully. I think they pick up on things that other people don't, or maybe other people don't think they'll pick up on. And I think they sometimes don't necessarily get there for the right reason, but they get to the right result. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've never really seen a jury trial that was really that far off. I've always been a big fan of the process of putting 12 people together and coming out with a result.
We hear, thanks to the media, a lot of stories about runaway juries and things like that. Do you think that's exaggerated, or do you think that, what is your reaction to that?
I never saw a runaway jury. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are some juries where judges do order additors or remittators, but the system's built to do that. Mm-hmm. And you can accept a verdict under protest. You can do all sorts of things. The judge in this state sits as a 13th juror. So there are built-in safeguards here to deal with anything that might be really out of the ordinary.
Did you ever exercise your power as a 13th juror?
Yes.
Was that rare?
Yes, I think I did it once.
And what was the reason, if you don't mind saying?
Because it needed to be exercised.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. What was your general reaction to juror deliberations? When would you? How far would you let it go before you would? Would you intervene? Would you talk to the jurors during the process? How would you deal with that?
I never really had too many where the jurors said they were deadlocked. I generally had juries come back with questions, some of which could be answered, some of which couldn't be, and you had to simply recharge them on the law. We got past that when we started giving the jurors the written charge instead of just an oral charge, which gave them something to work with rather than something they had to remember without taking any notes. Of course, we also began allowing jurors to take notes and sometimes providing them with notebooks with the exhibits in advance so they could be provided with, real-time copies of the exhibits. So I never really had problems with jurors.
Did you allow jurors to ask questions?
Yes.
You were part of that initial
Yes.
pilot project. I think you and Judge Childers worked on that. Is that correct?
Yes. I always allowed jurors to ask questions, but I would tell them basically, I would give them a little charge in advance telling them that they could ask questions and how they were to do that, what the mechanism was to do that.
What was the mechanism?
It was to write it out and send it back through the bailiff. Or to bring them in. I'm trying to remember whether I brought them back in and had them pass it up. But then you talk to the attorneys and kind of reach a consensus on how that question should be answered, if it could be answered.
You tried your last jury trial in, 1990? You went on 1996. Okay. Obviously, since then, there have been some other issues that have come up with jurors in terms of Facebook, Google, cell phones, etc. I assume you didn't have any of those issues you had to deal with jurors at that time.
We had the internet.
Okay.
So jurors did do, I did have an instruction about internet research, and I actually did have jurors sometimes go outside the evidence.
Yeah.
But did not have the same kinds of issues that are present today.
That's interesting. When I've always wondered how, when the judge instructs the jury to don't do this and don't do this, and sometimes you think that's almost exactly, if you've had that's going to encourage them to do that. How do you make sure that jurors really do follow your instructions?
Well, I'm a little bit past. Of course, I was a judge at an earlier time. I don't know how the judges are doing it at this point. I don't know that you can really assume that if you tell a juror not to do internet research or not to look at Facebook or not to, to research something, that when they go home at night they're not going to do it. Yeah. I mean, you can only ask them and really ask them to promise not to do it and explain to them. And I think the explanation is that what they are supposed to be doing is listening to the facts and taking the law that's provided to them and applying them to those facts. The facts that they get in the courtroom are the only facts they're allowed to consider. And if they consider facts that another juror isn't considering, then everybody is considering different facts. And the only facts that they can consider are the ones that come out in court. Mm-hmm. And I think if you explain it that way, I think you're more likely to get jurors to kind of buy into it.
In your experience, during your 6 years or so as a trial judge, you thought for the most part jurors did that?
I only had one that didn't.
Really?
Yes.
And that was when you invoked your 13th juror?
No, that was a juror that I held in contempt.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And we went through the process, and actually I think Amy Wyrick and Jennifer Nichols were the prosecutors who prosecuted the contempt case.
Amy Wyrick, the district attorney in Memphis now,
yes.
And Jennifer Nichols, who's
a judge now.
Who's a judge now, yeah. Okay.
I believe both of them were there and prosecuted the contempt case.
Really?
And the juror was held in contempt.
Wow. Can you tell me generally what the juror, I'm just intrigued, what the juror did?
The juror had called a friend who was a physician, and the case was a med-mal case. Mm-hmm. And so the juror was asking questions about the medicine.
Wow. You told us a while ago that you first became interested in the judgeship when you were clerking for Judge Sorg in Pennsylvania. When did you first begin to think about moving to become an appellate judge?
1994, the Tennessee plan was put in place.
Now tell us what the Tennessee plan is.
Well, the Tennessee plan for the Supreme Court, it had been a type of Tennessee plan had been in place for the Intermediate Appellate Court, but had not been for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was just elected, nominated and on party lines and elected. But in 1994, I believe it was 94, I don't think it was 93, the Tennessee plan went into effect. And for the first time, there was an open seat on the Supreme Court that was supposed to be filled under the Tennessee plan. And I decided to apply for it, not really believing that I really had a shot at it, but I thought it would be an interesting process to go through to see how you did it in case I wanted to really take a shot at it later.
And you were going to apply for that when that seat became open in 90?
I think it was 94.
94, yeah. And how did that seat become open?
I believe it was an Eastern seat. So I'm drawing a blank on who in the East retired.
Okay.
I think it could have been O'Brien.
Okay.
It was O'Brien.
And so you wanted to apply, and the process, tell us what the process was in those days for being considered for the Supreme Court.
Before the Tennessee plan or after?
When you applied.
When I applied, it was, nobody really knew because it was new. And so what was supposed to happen, which ultimately did, was anyone who was interested in the seat applied. And under the Constitution, you could have no more than 2 per grand division, but under the statute, there were 3 seats that were denominated for the grand divisions and 2 open seats, 2 at-large seats. So the Eastern seat was vacant. And people applied from the West and the East. And while all of that was going on, there was litigation over the Tennessee plan itself that I didn't have any involvement in. But there were
people challenging the
people
constitutionality.
challenging the Tennessee plan, and I think there was also concern about there was an evaluation process and whether or not someone had to go through the evaluation process during this run. It was a very confused state of events. I didn't follow it that closely because it really didn't involve me. But what ended up happening is that there was a special Supreme Court that was appointed, and the special Supreme Court made rulings running up to the election. And essentially what happened was, as I recall, Governor McWhorter actually announced he was appointing Penny White before he realized that the Tennessee plan was in place. So we all applied for, I'm confusing the issue. We all applied for it. The governor had already announced that Penny would be the new Supreme Court justice. We had the Tennessee plan, and so people then had to go through the motions of applying for the seat. And one of the reasons I applied was because I knew I wasn't going to get it, because it had already been announced that Penny was going to be appointed. So there was sort of no harm, no foul. And so some of us applied, and Penny was appointed.
Tell me again why, although no harm, no foul, that you felt, even though the governor had announced what the ultimate outcome was going to be, that you wanted to go ahead and go through the process.
Because it was a new process. I thought it would be interesting to see how it worked. And I knew at some point in time, or thought at some point in time, I might want to apply for some other seat later.
Okay.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it would be. At least I would understand how the process worked.
So even though the judge had announced what he was going to, the governor had announced what he was going to do,
right,
you felt you would like to be an appellate judge. And
at some point.
At some point. And this process would help you along the way on that.
Right. And this was the first time it had been, tested. Mm-hmm. And so I just didn't see there was any reason why I shouldn't simply go ahead and do it.
Okay. And what happened in that process?
Penny was appointed.
Okay. All right.
So I continued on the trial bench, and then in 1996, I believe it was 1996, the general election came up. Penny had to run in that election and was defeated.
She lost the
Right.
I can't remember how you describe it. A Tennessee plan
retention
election.
vote.
The retention vote. Thank you. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, she lost the retention
And
vote.
I think at that time, she was the first judge in the country to have lost, an appellate judge to have lost a retention vote. Is that correct?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think there were a few others. I'm thinking maybe another or two who had lost, but it was the first test of that election. And running up to that election, this is where I was getting confused with 1994 and 1996, but running up to that election was when there were challenges to the process and how or whether there had to be an evaluation and all kinds of things that had to do with the Tennessee plan itself. That's when the special Supreme Court was appointed to make determinations about those issues, because the current members of the Supreme Court recused themselves.
Okay. All right.
So there were a series of rulings all the way through to the election, and Penny lost. At that point, people started applying again. And I applied, and a number of other people applied. And the Supreme Court, which had, as I recall, never really issued an opinion, had issued a series of orders. Then, post-election, issued an opinion in which it kind of pulled it all together, what it had done and what the result was of what it had been doing. Mm-hmm. Part of that opinion took into consideration post-election facts that Penny had lost. All the issues up to that point really had to do with the pre-election issues running up to the election. So then there was the election, and the opinion then took into consideration issues that I don't believe had been raised at any point, but that the court felt were necessary to be decided so that this position could be filled. And one of the pronouncements was that the seat could only be filled by someone from the East.
From the East Tennessee.
Because it was an Eastern designated seat.
And how did you react to that?
I contacted my good friend Jeff Feibelman,
Attorney
who was involved in some of the litigation leading up to the election, and consulted with him, and we filed a lawsuit.
Okay.
So that lawsuit was filed in Chancery Court in Davidson County, and it was one of those cases that was determined quickly by the Chancery Court, and then there was an appeal filed and a reach-down motion with it. So the Supreme Court was asked to reach down and take it from the Supreme Court and make the decision itself.
The special Supreme Court or the Supreme Court?
The real Supreme Court.
Okay, all right. And so you actually had to file a lawsuit to be considered
yes.
as a candidate for the Supreme Court selection. Were you concerned about how that would, the impact of that in the legal community, how that would be, whether that could hurt your candidacy for a judge or just felt something
yes.
you had to do? Okay. And how did you resolve that issue?
I didn't. There wasn't a real way to resolve it other than to let it play out and hope that it wasn't going to be something that was going to be too devastating to what I was attempting to do.
And you prevailed in that lawsuit?
Yes.
Okay. And that gave you the opportunity then to apply for the position?
Well, the applications were already in.
Okay. Get your candidacy to be considered.
Exactly.
All right. Okay. And that would have been a decision by the governor at that time?
Well, it was, again, the Tennessee plan.
The commission first.
3 people sent to the governor, and the governor makes a decision.
And even after this lawsuit that you had to file to be considered, the selection commission sent your name?
Yes.
All right. And who were the other 2 names they sent? Do you remember?
Mickey Barker and George Brown.
All right. Okay. And tell me about that process. What did you do after that? After you came through the commission?
Well, there really wasn't much to do except wait to see what the governor was going to do. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did, was wait to see what the governor was going to do.
Were you interviewed by the governor, or interviewed by the governor's legal counsel, or both?
I was interviewed by the governor.
Okay. All right. And do you remember, can you share with us?
The legal counsel at that time was Hardy Mays.
Hardy Mays, who, of course, you knew well from your previous campaign for a trial judgeship in Memphis.
Yes.
Yeah. And can you share with us the sort of questions that... who was the governor at the time? Excuse me.
Governor Don Sunquist.
Right. Can you share with us some of the questions that...
I think I was so nervous, I don't remember them. I really don't. I mean, it wasn't anything terribly soul-searching or intrusive. It was just a regular interview that, like, you'd have a job interview. It wasn't...
How did you prepare for it?
There wasn't a way to prepare for it.
Yeah, you just went in and talked, answered the questions. And then you I assume you got a phone call. Or were you asked to come back in?
Yes, I got a phone call. It was an odd situation. I wasn't just asked to... I was asked to travel, to take my mother, travel to Nashville, and be at the residence, stay overnight, and then I was taken by state troopers into the Capitol through a side entrance, and then the governor made an announcement people, I think, sort of were guessing who he was going to announce, but he didn't make the announcement until that time.
And so, but you did not know when you were told to come there with your mother what the decision was going to be?
Oh, yes, I knew exactly what the decision was.
I was going to say, you figured,
no,
you were told
he
that.
didn't
Okay.
want anyone else to know.
I see.
And so he was attempting to do it in a way that would not signal what he was going to do.
So did you and your mother stay at the governor's
Yes.
residence the night before? How are the accommodations?
Very nice.
Okay, very good. So then the governor makes the announcement. Were you with him when he made
Yes.
the announcement? Were you sworn in then, or?
I was sworn in a few days later, and there was no ceremonial. It wasn't a ceremonial swearing-in ceremony. Someone else didn't swear me in, and then he did it. It was all one thing. I mean, I was not a Supreme Court justice until he swore me in.
Okay.
And I'm sorry. He didn't administer the oath. He didn't administer the oath, and I'm trying to remember whether it was the Chief Justice. It would have been Al Birch who
Okay.
administered the oath. Yes, Al
Okay.
Birch administered the oath. Governor Sundquist was in the audience, but did not, of course, administer the oath.
Now, you're becoming a Tennessee Supreme Court justice following Justice Penny White, who had lost her retention election. Did those unique circumstances, what was your reaction to that? Or did you even think about it? Did it affect you in any way?
Well, her loss, I think, was felt deeply by a lot of women in the state. So it was the loss of the second woman who had ever been on the court. So I was taking her place, literally, and I really felt like I had to be a model jurist representing not just the Supreme Court as a justice, but as the only woman on the Supreme Court.
Did you talk with Penny White after your selection?
Not really, not at that particular point in time. But she and I were friends before, and we're friends now. It was just a very hard time for her.
Yeah. When you went on the Supreme Court bench, I asked you a moment ago when you were on the trial bench who your mentors were. Were there mentors on the Supreme Court bench that you found? Either on the bench or not on the bench?
That's hard to answer. Everyone who was on the court, I mean, everybody was different, and everyone had their niche, their strengths. And I think I really learned a lot from all of them in their own way. So I don't know that I'd say there was someone who did or didn't mentor me. But I got support from, for example, Frank Dorota, who sent his law clerk down to help me out. Because, of course, going from the trial bench to the Supreme Court is a whole different world than going from an intermediate appellate court to the Supreme Court. You have no staff in place, you have no office, you have nothing. I mean, you're really starting from scratch with no real background in how the appellate system works. So it's a tough transition. It's a far harder transition than shifting from the intermediate appellate court to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. So how did you make that transition? What did you do?
Well, it was difficult. Justice Rota's law clerk came down, and back then, Rule 11 applications, which, as you know, were applications for permission to appeal, you were assigned every fifth one to present at conference. And during those days, all of the records were sent to you. Okay. So I was at the circuit court still before I had to vacate my circuit court chambers. And one day, UPS or FedEx came in with a mountain of boxes for me to use to prepare for the Rule 11 conference that was coming up. And it was, I mean, I'm sure I was just dumbfounded because there was no way I could go through any of them and no way I could even refer to any of them. I had no staff. I had no help, and these boxes then had to be returned to whatever Supreme Court they came from, whatever Jackson, Nashville, or Knoxville, and someone had to figure out how to send them back. So that was my first experience, was getting all these boxes that I needed for the Rule 11 conference. And then the question was, where would I have an office? So I ended up in White Station Tower, where they worked at building out some office space. And I had to find an administrative assistant, and I had to find law clerk. Back then, there was one law clerk.
Who was your first law clerk?
My first law clerk was Doug Hansen. And my administrative assistant was Kathy Collier from beginning to end. And we started out that way, and we were there for a while before we finally kind of got permission to move down here to Peabody Place area, 119 South Main. And so we built out space there, and we were there for a while. So it was a very, very difficult transition. Plus, I was also hearing and deciding cases that were criminal cases, which I hadn't had that much experience doing. I mean, I had some background, but not a vast amount. Most of my experience was on the civil side, so I also had to learn from scratch all the civil side and death penalty cases, and it was a tough learning curve.
Who were your colleagues on the Supreme Court at that time? You mentioned Justice Strwoda. Who else?
Justice Strwoda, Riley Anderson, Al Birch, and Lyle Reed.
And how did they receive this new female justice on the court?
Well, they dealt with me as best they could. We were different generations, and I think they were welcoming in their own way. They were just different. They weren't accustomed really to having women on the court. And they had to we had to kind of get to know each other.
Yeah. Now, you told us a while ago that when you went on the trial bench, you immediately felt this is where you were supposed to be.
Exactly.
Even with the transition issues to the Supreme Court, did you feel at that point that was where you were supposed to be, or did you grow into the job?
I think I had to grow into it.
Yeah.
It was a difficult transition, getting familiar with just the procedures and the practice. And at that point, we were traveling. We didn't have video conferencing, so we were traveling constantly. We were in Nashville a lot for opinion conferences, Rule 11 conferences, and at that point, sometimes we took our administrative assistants with us to be able to work on orders and other things that we were doing. So it was kind of, in technology terms, it was kind of the dark ages, before much technology was available. And the very first couple of years were difficult. A lot of travel, a lot of effort in getting to know subject matter that I wasn't terribly familiar with, procedures that I didn't know very well. So it was difficult.
Did you ever have any second thoughts at that time that maybe you wish you had been back on the trial bench, or was this something you were just, with Janice Holder, were just determined to get done?
Well, I've got to admit I love the trial bench. So I won't say that I wished I was back there, but I really missed it in some ways. And, I had to grow into the position. I had to really work at becoming effective at what I was doing.
I asked you earlier when you were a trial judge if that was a lonely kind of job, and you said it wasn't. Was the Supreme Court justice position more of an isolated job, or was that?
Much more so, because of the travel. And even if you were in town, most people wouldn't think you were in town and would think you were out of town. So everyone thought you were always out of town. Most people thought I lived in Nashville. So you really didn't connect with people very easily because you were just never here. So it was difficult. It was very isolating.
The U.S. Supreme Court, I understand, has some traditions that are fulfilled by the, quote, junior, unquote, justice on the court. Was there a similar kind of tradition in the Tennessee Supreme Court when you were the rookie on the bench?
No, that never really occurred, except for the seating. And the seating arrangement, of course, was your Chief Justice in the middle, the second in seniority was to the right, third was to the left, and then to the far right is number 4, and to the far left is number 5. Beyond that, with a 5-member court, it's really difficult to divide things up that way. People really had to be responsible for their section of whatever. And you were assigned boards and commissions to be a liaison to those boards and commissions, and everybody took their role seriously and did what they were assigned to do.
The Tennessee court then, I assume, as now, sat in 3 places across the state.
Yes.
And did you like that? Was it something you enjoyed, or something? Do you wish the court sat in one place?
I don't know. Having justices in 3 different grand divisions is a challenge for purposes of communication, and that's why the travel became so necessary, where everybody met in Nashville. Once the video conferencing kicked in, then it was of lesser concern, but we then ran into technological issues about lag time on the video conferencing on the early days, and it's not quite the same when you're talking to somebody on a video camera as when you're sitting in a room with them, and that was an issue. But we have the Constitution that requires us to sit in 3 grand divisions, so we have a Constitution that requires us to sit in 3 grand divisions.
Now, when you went on the bench in 96?
96. December 13th, 1996.
You remember the day?
It was Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th, okay. And you talked about the first couple of years and the transition that you made. When were you no longer the newest member of the Supreme Court bench?
When Justice Barker came on the court. Justice Reed retired, and I think that was about 18 months into my tenure on the Supreme Court. And then Justice Barker was appointed to fill his vacant position.
And how did you work with Justice Mickey Barker?
Well, everybody who comes on the court has a different personality. So you just work as best you can with 4 other people who have very different personalities. And of course, he was very lively and kind of a stand-up comic, and very.
How do you work with people like that? Yes.
So it was always interesting.
Yeah. Now, at a certain point, however, you were not only were not the rookie justice anymore, you weren't the only female justice anymore. When did that change come about?
2005, Justice Dorota retired, and Justice Clark was appointed.
Connie Clark.
2005.
And then another female justice came on board.
Right. Then Justice Wade came on board.
Justice Wade first, okay.
Yes, Justice Wade came on next. And then Justice Lee, and then Justice Koch.
Sharon Lee.
Right.
So at some point, you were a part of a majority female Tennessee Supreme Court.
Exactly.
And that was a historic moment.
It certainly was.
And when did you become Chief Justice?
It was September 1, 2008.
Okay. And tell us about the role of the Chief Justice. What's different about that role?
It's a little different, but it's a lot of the same. Everybody, I would say that because of the size of the court, everyone on the court pretty much knows the job. There are liaisons to commissions that are very important. There are various and assorted administrative roles that get spread out among all of us. But the Chief Justice does different things. And of course, the Chief Justice is going to assign the opinions to write. So that happens. The Chief Justice takes the role of lead in the conferences, both the administrative conferences and the opinion conferences that are held on a monthly or sometimes more than monthly basis. So you're really the lead person in terms of the administrative work of the court. You also take the lead to some extent in other areas where the court and other branches of government meet, or you may be the spokesperson or the person that's asked more frequently to give speeches on various topics. So it's sometimes sort of ceremonial. On the court side, it's more administrative, and you're really taking more of a role in how the court functions.
I want to ask you about that role of the Chief Justice with other branches of government and the public, because I've always thought it's interesting. Some people make the mistake sometimes of referring to the Chief Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court when your title was Chief Justice of Tennessee.
Correct.
Is your title. And that's a different role simply than being the Chief Judge of the court, is it not?
It is, but I mean, I would say the way the court worked while I was on it, making a transition from one person to the next as Chief Justice was almost seamless because everyone really understands the job. It's a little bit different than when you think it is, I believe, when you're watching it. But there's still so much in common with the other justices and their roles that I don't think it's a difficult transition to make. So it is an interesting role. When I was Chief Justice, we had the Access to Justice initiative that was begun, and so that was a big initiative. And of course, I was the spokesperson for that.
Tell us what the Access to Justice initiative is.
Well, back, I want to say in 2007, Supreme Court had long-range planning, strategic planning sessions all along. But I remember, and I'm pretty sure it was 2007, we had a retreat and we had a planning session and we agreed that access to justice, equal access to justice, should be the Supreme Court's #1 priority in that year and in future years. And from that point on, we devised a method of getting the word out as to what our commitment was, and in creating an Access to Justice Commission that was tasked with coming up with some of the solutions to the problems of equal access to justice in Tennessee. So when there was an announcement to be made or something that had to do with access to justice and the initiative, generally I was the person doing that. I was the court's liaison to the Access to Justice Commission, which we created. And so there was a major role that I had while I was Chief Justice and beyond that.
Did you have to make speeches to lawyer groups and different groups around the state about the Access to Justice initiative?
Yes, I did quite a bit of that. In fact, I did a lot of that right up to the very end.
Yeah, the end of your service
Yes.
in the court. Did you write your own speeches?
Yes, by and large. But with access to justice, you were relying a lot on statistics and other things that would come from the AOC. So I'd get people in the AOC to help me to make sure what I was saying was accurate.
What was the general response of first the bar and then the public to your Access to Justice initiatives?
I think it was a positive response on both fronts. I'm not certain because I'm never certain that people are going to tell me exactly what they're thinking.
Yeah.
But I really thought that it was a good program, and I think that as I'm watching it now, I think that it's moving forward. We're getting more contributions that can be put into areas involving access to justice, and I think people are understanding more about the need for people of low income who cannot afford a lawyer. It's not as if the Access to Justice programs are taking away from lawyers' livelihoods, because the people who are being assisted are people who could not afford legal representation at any cost.
You were the first female Chief Justice in Tennessee.
Yes.
Did you feel some particular responsibility because of that role?
I think I did. Looking back, I think I wanted to make sure that what I did made the rest of the court proud, that they wouldn't be sorry that they chose me, and that it would be a successful 2 years. So I think I did.
Did you enjoy being Chief Justice?
Yes.
What was it about being Chief Justice that was particularly gratifying to you?
Well, large measure, it was the access to justice connection that I think was the most satisfying. Also, when you are Chief Justice, you contribute by means of the Conference of Chief Justices, and that's a very interesting organization where the Chief Justices of other states get together, and there are programs, and you learn from the other states what they're doing and how you can improve things in your state. So that was very interesting, and you make friendships there that continue on.
Now, when you went on the bench, the Supreme Court bench in 1996, you were the only female member of the bench, and then
Justice Clark.
Justice Connie Clark came along, and then Justice Lee
Yes.
came along. And what year did Justice Lee come along?
She was 2008. So I had 2005, 6, 7, and 8. Yes. No, I think it might have been Justice Koch who came on in 8.
Okay.
No. I'm getting those two confused. So it was definitely Justice Clark and Justice Wade, and then I think Justice Lee and Justice Koch, or it could have been Justice Koch and Justice Lee. I'm sorry. But it was 2005, 6, 7, and 8 is when they came on.
And when Justice Lee came on the bench, now you have a majority female Supreme Court.
Yes.
In Tennessee. What was that change like, or was it really a change in any respect?
The big change was when Justice Clark came on the court. It was a sea change, having a second woman.
What did she bring to the court?
It was someone who was generational to some extent, and it's hard to explain. It was something. It was more collaborative than everyone sort of going off and doing their own thing. Mm-hmm. She kind of introduced a more collaborative effort for the court, and she and I might do something together or, collaborate in some fashion. Mm-hmm. So it was just a different atmosphere. And then by the time that Justice Lee got on the court, it was already in place, and then having a majority female court, it's different. It's different than what I originally was accustomed to.
How much longer did you serve on the Tennessee Supreme Court?
I retired from the bench on August 31st, 2014.
And what was the reason why you decided it was time to do something else in life?
I just decided it was time to do something else in life.
Okay.
I woke up one morning and thought, I've been there almost 18 years, or at that point it would have been 17 years. And, I have one more, cycle coming up, 2014. I would be required to run again for office. And I wasn't certain I really wanted to spend more than another year on the court. So I thought, why would I run to spend another year on the court? It probably makes sense to retire in 2014. So I made plans quite a bit of time before then to retire from the bench.
I want to talk about what you've done since that time, but this would be a good time. Let's take a break for a few minutes here, and then we'll go into our final areas of our discussion today. Thank you. Were you active in the judicial conference during the years that you may still be active in the judicial conference, particularly when you were on the Supreme Court bench?
I was active. Again, Judge Childers got me involved in the Pattern Jury Instruction Committee. So I started out in the beginning on the Pattern Jury Instruction Committee, and that was really my primary focus for a long time in the judicial conference. And I had some leadership roles too along the way.
And what about the judicial conference appealed to you, other than the camaraderie of your fellow judges?
Well, I always felt that I learned as much from talking to the judges during social events and other events as I did through the programs themselves. And learning what their experiences were and how they handled various kinds of cases and problems was really very beneficial. Plus, it also gave you a network of people to call if you had issues that you wanted to discuss. And it was kind of neat knowing that you knew the judges all across the state.
Back to your retirement. You were young when you retired. You're still young, but you were very young when you announced your retirement.
Not really.
Well, I think you were young.
Well, thank you. But I was 65. I was only 65.
Okay.
2 days before I retired, I was 65.
Okay. And why did you decide to retire at that particular age? Any particular
It sounded like a good idea at the time. It really did.
Okay.
And I really felt that every now and then change is good. And I had been on the appellate bench for almost 18 years.
Yeah.
And I thought it was time for a change. I had not done anything in my life for 18 years.
I want to talk about a particular interest that you pursued and work that you did over the years. First, probably as a lawyer, and then as a trial judge and on the Supreme Court, and that is the TLAP, as we sometimes call it, the Tennessee Lawyers Assistance Program. When did you first become involved in that program, and why?
Well, part of what I was talking about earlier when I was in and out of law firms, one of the law firms I was in briefly was Dice, Burson, and Holder. And that was John Dice, Paul Burson, and me. And it was a short period of time, but John Dice killed himself. And that was in 86. And it became very apparent to me that a lot of us had information that if we had pulled our information, we may have been able to have affected a different kind of outcome than his suicide. And so I thought it would be a good idea to start a program in Shelby County. So this all started in Shelby County. So in 1987, I asked the Bar Association if they would be willing to start a committee, and then we called it a committee, although it wasn't run like other committees. But it was a committee of the Memphis Bar Association. It was the Lawyers Helping Lawyers. In Nashville, they had one called Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, TBA. And so we had Lawyers Helping Lawyers in Shelby County, and it was a core group of people who really ran the program themselves. So the committee ran the program. If there was a concern or if someone had a lawyer they were concerned about, they could call a committee member. So it was sort of a very loose organization. We didn't have an executive director. We had built-in issues of confidentiality, but we did help quite a few people in the time that the Lawyers Helping Lawyers Committee existed. When I went on the court in 1996, it was very obvious to me that we had all kinds of things in place. We had the Lawyers Fund for Client Protection that protected the public when somebody did something, a lawyer did something that was adverse to a client. But we didn't have the other piece of that puzzle, which was helping that lawyer who may have taken money or done something inappropriate because they had either a mental problem or a problem with substance. And so I wanted to see if we could start a statewide program. So it was my mission to start a statewide program in Tennessee. And the other justices sort of listened to me, but not a whole lot. And we went on a retreat, and I encouraged them to listen to somebody from out of state come to the retreat and explain lawyers' assistance programs in another state and how it worked. We got a gentleman by the name of Mike Crowley from Texas who came to our retreat and explained to the other four justices how the program worked, why it was essential that we have one statewide. And to their credit, by the time that he left, the consensus was, how fast can we get this done? And so we created a committee to create a rule, to draft a rule that would be a statewide rule. And we took sort of the unprecedented step of adding $10 more to the BPR fee, even before we had the rule in place. We got the rule in place and proceeded to create a commission, TLAP commission, and that's how we got started. And I am very proud to say that the Tennessee Lawyers Assistance Program is really considered pretty much to be the gold standard in this country. And it's the model on which a lot of other programs are based, and we are very well thought of by other states who either adopt our rule or with modifications, or look to the Tennessee Lawyers Assistance Program for guidance.
Did you have support from the bar from the outset, or were there issues you had to deal with, objections or any concerns such as that?
I don't remember a lot of issues or concerns at the time, although it's not something I would have necessarily focused on because issues and concerns would work themselves out over time. But it was something that was very, very much needed, and something that the state really could benefit by having a central clearinghouse where you've got a director, and now a director and assistant director, who can field calls. We have a volunteer program across the state so that the director can call anybody anywhere and get a volunteer to intervene if necessary, to call someone, to visit someone. But we have a very large number of volunteers across the state who are either in recovery or have training about substance and mental health and other issues.
What is it about the legal profession that creates issues for a lot of lawyers, issues for dealing from substance abuse to depression to anxiety to, even in the most dramatic example, suicide? Is there something about the nature of our work that you think leads to these problems from time to time?
Just from a personal view, without really getting into the studies that have been done, to me, having the responsibility of helping somebody else with their own problems puts the kind of pressure on people that we're not really, sometimes we don't handle very well. And so I think to some extent it involves the nature of the job itself, the pressure that we put on ourselves, the pressure that the system puts on us, and I think it starts, and it may very well attract those people who are the type who really are perfectionists, who demand a lot of themselves. So I think it's a number of things, but there are a lot of, I think there have been studies that have been done. The Haltom study, it's Commission on Lawyers Assistance Programs and Haltom study. It was combined study that really details some of the findings of the problems with the profession. And I think there are innovative ways of tackling the problem, starting in law school and moving forward. And I think there are a lot of programs going forward.
Let's talk about your retirement. What are your interests? What have you done? What are you doing these days?
Well, I'm at this point sort of fell into a little bit of mediation that has developed into a fair amount of work. So I'm really enjoying that. It's a different way of applying the knowledge that I've gained from doing the trial work and trial bench and appellate bench, and applying it to the solution of problems that people bring into mediation. So I've enjoyed that. I'm doing a little more arbitration at this point through the AAA primarily, and I'm sitting on the juvenile court bench as designated from time to time by the Chief Justice where there are conflicts that someone needs to be appointed to handle. So I'm doing that. And then I've always had a number of interests that I kind of fall in and out of, but my main extracurricular interest has always been, or the last 29 years or so, has been karate and training pretty much every day, not always every day, but many times a week, and continuing to take instruction and to learn more about karate and weapons work and doing things like that.
You both train and teach?
Yes, I taught for quite a while, about 3 days a week, and largely my students were children. But it's now a combination of those. I also still scuba dive, though not as much, and I'm hoping to get back into that. I've got a golf game that isn't all that great, and I'm planning to hit a few more balls and try to ease back into the golf game. But I would say that my main activity right now really focuses on the karate.
And when did you develop that interest?
It was 1989.
Really? And was there something in particular that sparked that interest?
I was transitioning out of horses. At that point, I had a horse that I owned who was living in Middleburg, Virginia, that I was really commuting to, and I sold my last horse just before I ran for office in 1990. So I was looking for something else that could ignite some passion, and ended up in karate, and I've just always been there. It's a very good thing for you physically, but it's also a very good thing for your concentration and your focus. And
is it mostly about self-defense and protection, or is it?
Well, that's part of it, but that's a different application. I would say this is more. This is more development of you from really the inside out, and it's really something that I can apply to work as well as everything else. That's my foundation, and I moved from karate to everything else.
Let's go back to your juvenile court work these days. So you sit from time to time?
Yes.
And where do you sit?
Juvenile Court of Memphis and Shelby County.
Right. And tell us what that experience is like for you.
Well, it's very interesting because I'm doing the civil side only. So I'm not doing the delinquency side. And the civil side is basically dependency, neglect, custody, the kinds of things to some extent that I did when I was on the trial bench. And so it lets me get back into those determinations and the kinds of things that I enjoyed doing when I was on the trial bench.
Since I know someone who worked in the juvenile court for some time, I'm interested in the unique aspects of that bench that involves not just making decisions, but some counseling and working with people and giving them opportunities. Do you enjoy that?
I do. I'm not down there as much as I would be if I had a regular position there. So I'm really called in just to do a case here and there. I can go for months without being called in to do anything.
Are there unique challenges to a juvenile court bench as opposed to the other benches you've sat in your life?
Well, the one thing that I didn't see anything of course, would have been dependency and neglect. And that, to me, is very difficult, to really make those determinations and to determine where children are placed. It's very difficult. But it's something that I think the magistrates in juvenile court do a very good job of. I think they work very hard at it. I think they're very caring.
Are you enjoying travel these days?
Yes.
France mostly?
Lots of France, a little bit of Italy, and I'm not exactly sure where the next stop will be the next year, but I'm going to get things planned. I do want to get something planned next winter that will get me out of the cold and into the warm.
There you go.
So that's my next project.
What are you reading these days? What do you enjoy reading?
Well, I just finished Otis Sanford's book, From Boss Crump to King Willie.
Otis Sanford, who was formerly the editor of the Memphis Commercial Appeal.
Yes.
Now journalism professor.
Yes. And then I read karate books, and you wouldn't know the titles of those, but The Inner Art of Karate is the last one. So.
This is a deeply personal question here at the end, but do you have any advice for lawyers who are considering, lawyers or judges who are considering retirement?
I don't know that my way of doing things will work for everyone, but I just stopped and decided I would just kind of look around and see what else was out there rather than try to make plans about what I was going to do next. That might not work for everyone, but it worked pretty well for me, just to not try to force an issue, not try to force myself into something new, and just to see what might be out there that might come down the pike to tell me what is available. Just to keep an open mind about what might be out there.
Do you have a schedule in your retirement or no schedule?
What do you mean by schedule?
Each day, do you schedule
Oh,
things?
no. Well, I schedule mediations and I schedule arbitrations. So that's my structure. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I have karate class. So between the mediations, arbitrations, and karate classes, that's my schedule, and then I fit everything else in around that.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoyed being with you.
Thank you, Bill.